We're actually thinking of ourselves as independent and distinct from the world and somewhat from each other. This is why this whole gender ideology issue is so big, because we don't even think about ourselves as being those who are going to propagate the next generation. We're just thinking about ourselves as self-contained individuals to whom the world and even our social circles are ultimately tools for us to make ourselves feel better.
All right, everyone. Welcome again. This is the Kirkwood Center podcast for theology and ethics. And the Kirkwood Center, we seek truth, value tradition, and fight to defend the foundations of a moral and just society. Today, I am honored with the presence, the online presence of my good friend and colleague, Lenny Esposito, who's been doing apologetics for, I won't say how many years.
20, at least 27, 28
20
years. 1996 is when I first started online in apologetics.
Online. That's
online in
ministry.
apologetics. I was definitely a
Right.
pioneer. Yes.
Exactly. So, we'll have to celebrate your 30th anniversary here.
Yeah.
What's up? And what we're going to do today is talk about apologetics. So we're going to take a little bit of a step back from the more particular issues and do a little bit more on sort of method here. 30,000-foot overview of what is apologetics and what do we think apologetics is, how it's being done today, and what has sort of shifted maybe in the culture that is telling us we may need to also be shifting our apologetical approach. So Lenny, why don't let's just start with the most simple question we could ask on this topic. What is apologetics? How do we usually define that?
Yeah. So traditionally, when we've talked about it, usually when I talk about this, you're at a conference, maybe you've been invited to speak to a group by a pastor or something like that, and you introduce yourself as an apologist, and people say, is that who you call in when the wife got mad at you and you're not quite sure how to get back into her good graces? Or
Right.
say, no. But
A very literal understanding of apology, right?
Apology, right? Exactly. So traditionally, we've always talked about it by pointing to 1 Peter 3:15, that we are commanded to make a defense for the faith that is set before us with evidence. So the Greek word for defense is apologia, which is a reasoned defense, the way a defense lawyer might argue before his client. We're to do so with gentleness and respect, First Peter goes on to say, but it's a reasoned defense. It's giving reasons for why you believe the things that you believe. Christianity has never been a faith that was built simply on faith. It's not, solo fidea. It's not faith alone in the exclusion of everything else. It's always faith based on fact.
Right.
This is so what are the reasons? Why do we hold to these things? Is there an argument to be made for that? And that was how apologetics has usually been understood, as providing the undergirding logic and evidence for the truth of Christianity.
Right. I mean, so the way as you said, just to reiterate, the way we often would define it would be the rational defense, right, of Christian truth claims using reason and evidence, and but grounded in scripture, as you pointed out. I mean, there's obviously we see this rational defense of Christianity being done in the Bible itself,
right?
Most usually by Paul, especially.
But Jesus does a very good job. I've always pointed to Luke chapter 20, where Jesus faces off against the Sadducees, then the Pharisees, then the Sadducees again. And it's fascinating how much logic and argumentation comes into play when they say, for example, they give the argument, they give a thought experiment, right? In philosophy,
Yeah.
we use thought experiments all the time. Well, there was this woman, and she was married to the husband, and he
Right.
dies, and
The
then she marries
parable
his
is the
brother.
philosophical thought experiment of the ancient world, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and then the brother dies, and then the brother dies, and she goes through all 7 brothers who all
Mhm.
die, and then she dies. And my first question is, what is this lady cooking at night? But then the
Right.
Sadducees who don't believe in the resurrection, she said, well,
Yep.
whose wife is she going to be then in the resurrection? Because she's been married to all 7 of these guys. And Jesus, so they're giving him a dilemma, and he splits the horns of the dilemma, saying, you're neither married nor given in marriage, right? So he says that your premises are faulty. So this is the kind of thing that happens. But then he pushes back, I'm not the God of the dead, but of the living, and he uses the one verse that the Sadducees basically key their theology from. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That was kind of the verse that they would put on their business cards.
Mhm.
And he says, how do you explain that? And so he catches them. So even Jesus would use these kinds of tactics and techniques in his engagement with others. And
Right.
it goes to show that, as John 1 says, he is the Logos. And that
Yes.
Logos, the word, that means reason. That's not
Yeah.
just
Yeah, John
a
didn't just
word.
pull that out of nowhere, by the
Yeah,
way.
he is he
He
is
used that for
he
good reason. Good reason.
yes, he's the thoughtful
Yeah.
manifestation
Yeah.
of the Father. So
Yeah,
in that
and,
sense.
I mean, I'd say too, so both in the pages of Scripture itself, we see Jesus himself using reasoned argumentation to
Right.
compel people, to a certain truth. We see Paul doing that in the book of Acts when he's at Mars Hill in Athens and he's reasoning. Well, Paul goes into in some places will go into the synagogues first and he's going to
Right.
reason from scriptures, but then when he's dealing with non-Jews, with the Gentiles, he's reasoning from their own texts, even
Right.
oftentimes, and what they've said about God, and then leading them from there to this particular God man, Jesus Christ. Um, and then I've also, been in some of the rabbinic literature recently as I work through the Old Testament using the JPS Torah commentary series, and reason and argumentation amongst the rabbis, I mean, the
Right.
Christian rabbis. I mean, this is just part and parcel of the historic Jewish faith as well. And then, of course, we could talk about the early church apologists from
Hmm.
Justin Martyr to Irenaeus and so on and so forth.
Tertullian. Yeah.
Tertullian, right? Who brought in. I'm in the middle of reading Clement of Alexandria now, who was a Greek philosopher. He was a
Yeah.
philosopher in Alexandria prior to becoming a Christian, and he's even making historical claims that people like that Plato himself sort of pilfered from Moses. So whether or not we'll ever know if that's true,
Yeah.
it's certainly there's always been a intersection, and that's another word of faith and reason.
Right.
Although there have been times in church history where either the faith part has been neglected
Hmm.
in favor of maybe something that is too rationalistic in its
Yeah.
approach to Christianity, to revelation. We have seen periods in the church's history of a sort of hyper rationalism that can get very untethered
Especially
from,
in the Enlightenment period. And
yeah, in the Enlightenment, especially. And then we've also seen moves in the opposite direction of a sort of fideism that would sort of downplay
right.
reason. Kind of see that in Luther a little bit. Um, um, but then in the 19th century too, you see a lot of sort of moves towards a sort of a faith only
Yeah, the
type of
primitive church
situation.
movement in the early 19th century, where you had a lot of folks who were trying to get back to the
Yeah.
to the way the apostles worship, right? So this is where the Church of Christ abandons using musical instruments. I don't read in the Bible where the apostles used musical instruments, so we're going to sing a cappella. And it does all these kinds of, and our modern Pentecostal movements are also very faith driven in their core. And in Kingdom Triangle, J.P. Moreland makes a really good assessment of how we kind of have three spheres in the modern church, at least the modern church of the late 20th century, where we had those that are driven, had knowledge theologically. A lot of the Reformed churches are very theologically driven, but they're maybe spiritually dry. You had the more traditional denominations who are very socially driven. They're about feeding the poor, about serving your fellow man, about helping those who are down. And then you have the Pentecostal churches who are very spiritually driven. The problem is that those many of the times those churches fall into one of those camps, one of those corners of the triangle, but they don't. We're supposed to be doing all three as the Church of Christ. And so when you emphasize one to the neglect of the other two, you get a bit of a poverty within Christendom.
And if you reduce the whole of the Christian life to just one, I think you put yourself in actually all kinds of problems.
Absolutely. It's just as much a mistake to think that Mr. Spock is the ideal for humanity as it is to think that,
well, who's all emotion and
Captain Kirk, I guess.
Kirk was a good mix. Yeah, he's a little more on the emotional side, a little more on the instinctual side, perhaps. Well, that's good. But now let's talk about a little bit more specifically. So we have a long history in the church of apologetics being done, the intersection of philosophy and theology, which in a sense, you have your paradigm figures throughout the church's history, whether it be Augustine and his synthesis of philosophical Platonism with biblical exegesis, with biblical theology, or Aquinas in the Middle Ages with Aristotle and biblical revelation, and so on and so forth. And those are just to name a few. But in the 19th century, we sort of have a sense, late 19th century, after figures like, Darwin, Marx, maybe Nietzsche,
Kant,
Kant, if you want to go back earlier. And then so the rise of sort of like a scientific materialism, right?
Yes.
Very much based in empirical knowledge and so on and so forth. There is kind of a renewed apologetical sort of effort, I think, that emerges in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Absolutely. Much more analytical
churches. Yeah, much more, right. And then, we get something like the fundamentals by the Princetonians, J. Gresham Machen, and so on and so forth. And this is also defense of the historical claims of Christianity, as well, not just sort of more philosophical claims.
Yeah, because that's when the documentary hypothesis starts running at the German higher critics in the late 1800s start offering the idea that they can kind of sniff out who did what. And we see this division between J, P, E, and D in the Pentateuch, and all of these kinds of charges start to come up where it's really the first round of critical thinking applied towards the biblical text. Biblical criticism is how we labeled it. So we have to.
This was the first kind of sense of critical theory. I was going back to some early stages of this by some of the 19th century German romantics like Goethe and the Schelling, I think there were Schlegel brothers, and who were applying this sort of deconstructive kind of deconstructing the biblical text, to show that these historical claims were, less than tenable. We think of like Lessing, for example, was an example of that. So this was there was always the philosophical attack, right? There's always sort of a philosophical skepticism. Of course, but then you get a historical a skepticism about
Right.
historical claims in the late 18th, early 19th century that really emerges. And so there's sort of like two branches, I'd say maybe two categories of apologetics that we talked about traditionally. One is sort of philosophical apologetics, and the other is sort of historical apologetics, and both are responding to different sort of sets of skepticism.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting that usually what happens in these cases, and if you follow kind of the growth of this subdiscipline, because it is truly a subdiscipline of theology proper.
Mhm.
Theology becomes the queen of the sciences, even as the medievals said, and everything else becomes its handmaiden, right? Apologetics is a subset of theology to show how theology can be appropriately understood, given the circumstances that we know. But what I think is interesting is there's always seems to be a certain milieu in the popular culture of that day, or a certain assumption. So when we're in the Middle Ages, there's a romantic notion in the world, right? The world is enchanted, and we don't doubt the idea that God would be there, that there would be a God, and he would be interested in the lives of men. You start to get kind of this deist idea of God's there, but he's disconnected somehow. And so we address those kinds of ideas. And then when the Enlightenment comes in and the concept becomes more well accepted that it doesn't take God to understand the world, we can do this through reason alone.
Mhm.
Now, that assumption becomes the bedrock that Christians then have to answer. And we start using reason kind of more formally to
Yeah.
show that God is a logical, a rational uh, concept, and it really is the best explanation for the understanding that we have. And I think some of that carries through to today as science becomes larger and larger in the popular culture. We learn more things about our world. We learn more things about the creation itself. We learn more things about our biology, and we use those to point back to God, right? So we no longer talk about the miracle of life in just the fact that it's a miracle of life. We talk about the miracle of life in the fact that DNA is a self-coding system, right? It's a messaging system, and so we can get more specific in the genome and things like that, but it always seems to be carried through the undercurrents of wherever the culture is today that Christians need to respond. This was true even,
Yeah.
as we said, in the early church. This is what, right, when Tertullian is writing his letter to the emperor, his apology to the emperor, he's saying, look, your primary complaint is that Christians aren't good citizens because they're not sacrificing to Caesar. We're better citizens than most of your people that you hold to, most of the Romans that you hold to. Heck, and he goes, I can prove it, because you guys in persecuting us, you'd rather take a woman and put her into a brothel than to put her into the lion's den, because for a Christian it's a worse fate for us to be defamed with our moral ethic than
Mhm.
it is to be martyred.
Right.
And so here's another way that Tertullian is making an apology for the Christian faith. And so the reason why I bring that up is because it's really interesting how what we're seeing today is the culture shifting again.
Yeah.
And it's the scientific thing is there, but it's not carrying the currents that it used to be.
Right.
And so apologetics is going to have to start shifting with it.
So that's good. Okay, so I want to try and formulate a basic principle here that I think you sort of ran us through historically, is that given the culture that the church is living in, there's a certain sort of, I don't want to say tit for tat, but there's a sort of you have to see what the culture's main presuppositions or presumptions are,
Right.
right? They're the culture's interpretation of reality.
Yeah.
And then you have to come in and sort of match um, that method, but then fill in the blanks where that culture is not seeing the whole picture because it's probably making errors. We as apologists have to fill in the blanks where the culture cannot with the Christian answers. So I think, like, again, I'm in Clement of Alexandria, so 3rd century AD, and he's got a letter called Exhortation to the Heathen, and he's going through all of the Greek and Roman gods, right? And he's showing
Yeah.
their deficiencies. Well, because although obviously there was a philosophical tradition in 3rd century AD, but now a very well developed one going back to Socrates, there were still folk religion was still very obviously prevalent. So you have both going on in the early church. You have philosophical responses, right, to the Platonists, and the Epicureans and the Stoics, filling in the blanks, given the philosophical uh, methodology that they're using to explain reality, filling in the blanks from a Christian perspective, from a
Right.
biblical perspective. But the early church was also responding to the layperson who really believed in, the Homeric gods, that they were out there and they were, like us, and you had to sacrifice to them and so on and so forth. The gods that, you know, um, this was the reason why Socrates had to drink the hemlock, right? He
Yeah.
refused to obey give credence to
Right.
those gods. But we can respond to those kinds of arguments as well, because obviously we believe in, the supernatural. We believe in God and we believe in angels and demons. And the early church is saying, in a sense, that these gods are something like man-made idols that demons use
Mm.
in order to attract worship to themselves, false worship, right?
Yeah, well, even in the Old Testament, right? You have the passages in Isaiah, in Jeremiah, where it's like, you go down into a forest. I think it was Jeremiah 10, right? You go down
Mhm.
to the forest, you cut down a tree, half of
Yeah,
it you burn in the fire, the other half you bow down
yeah,
and offer sacrifices to. Does this make any sense to you?
yeah,
So this has a long history
right. Well,
within.
Jeremiah 10's a good one. If it is 10:14, it's my life verse.
Oh, okay.
At 10:14, people can look it up.
See,
All people are
I
stupid and ignorant. They're the
I
greatest lines in the Bible. I apply that to myself, of course.
my life verse is Proverbs 27:14 is a loud voice early in the morning is considered a curse to you. Because usually I'm the guy that's being loud early in the morning and everybody's
Okay.
like, no, I'm not ready for it yet. No. So
Well, then, so taking this principle as culture changes and history progresses, if we want to say that, um, you get into the philosophical speculations of the early moderns, right? Culminating sort of in Kant. Then there's a philosophical response. And then when you get
right.
into the scientific empiricism of the 19th and 20th centuries, lo and behold, what kind of emerges? Well, we could bring it up to our own era, I
Right.
think.
Yeah, I think it
That
starts with Paley actually, but
I was going to say Paley is probably like a good 19th century example of somebody who's responding to the science of his time.
right.
And even more recently, both of these men are still alive. As far as our evangelical apologetics of recent times, I think of men like Richard Swinburne and Alvin Plantinga
Yeah.
as sort of like the fountainheads of kind of, at least in the philosophical side,
Yeah, analytic
and not so much
philosophy
on the
and
historical apologetics,
right.
defending the biblical reliability stuff. But on the philosophical side, you think of two guys who sort of responded to the scientific empiricism, the analytic philosophy of their time, and sort of
Yeah.
have launched 1,000 ships. Um, and we have a whole, now second, maybe even third generation of
Yeah.
sort of
Well, and
analytic
I think
philosophy.
that's true from the analytics side. I think C.S. Lewis is doing quite a bit, maybe answering the Continentals, and he's
Yeah.
doing it more of that type of an approach. But the Continental philosophy, I don't think had been as attractive,
Hmm.
especially within apologetic circles, and so we don't see a lot of apologists adopting kind of the continental story model, where a Derrida would write a novel, for
Yeah.
example. You don't get a lot of kind of philosophic novels
Right.
other than maybe a Lewis, and then some Catholics, Tolkien, and
Yeah.
others. But
And then you got to wait to, and then you get into have to read stuff like this.
yeah,
I
that's
finally just finished, but so there is okay. Let's talk about that because I do have the sense, Craig and William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland's book "Philosophical Foundations" just had its 20th anniversary.
that's right.
And being sort of like I know I went to the Biola and did the Biola Apologetics program and another degree at Talbot, and you're intimately familiar with that whole sort of scene and all those folks.
Right.
So you've been embedded in that. I've studied in that vein of analytic philosophy, religion, and then of course the defenses of the historical reliability, where you get like big name scholars who've done excellent work, like N.T. Wright or um, Gary Habermas on the resurrection and others. And I feel like okay, maybe when we start talking about the shift a little bit. In one sense, you might say, now obviously some atheistic materialist is out there is going to totally disagree with this statement, but we might say there's a reasonable amount of Christian resources that have been built up
Yeah,
in the area of analytic philosophy of religion and historical biblical studies over the last 30 or 40 years.
absolutely.
Like there's
Absolutely.
a wealth of material there,
There's
even if
a
you disagree with it.
and there's a lot more
Yeah,
organizations, just apologetics organizations that exist today that I mean, when Walter Martin started,
yeah,
CRI, there was nothing like it.
yeah.
A Christian
Research institute.
academic and
Yeah.
research institute. That was something that was
That
really
wasn't just like
unique.
a seminary itself, like a
No,
actual.
it was an independent entity, and
Right.
and now there's dozens, if not more, really fine stuff from countercult ministries like Watchman Fellowship
Right.
to cultural engagement folks to even specific specialty organizations, Life Training Institute, for example, if you're talking specifically about abortion and
Right.
things like that. So yeah, there's a lot of diversity now. There's a lot more resources that one can draw upon than there used to be.
And you'd say there's a range of levels there too. I mean, I
Absolutely.
don't think anybody anymore can shake. I mean, with when Planning came on the scene, and then and Swinburne and their sort of disciples, and the people that we've personally met and whether studying with William Lane
Well,
Craig or
J.
J.P.
Warwick
Moreland,
Montgomery.
right, and so, no, I think unless somebody's sort of like a trolling kind of YouTube atheist, um, nobody can say that, there isn't a high level of Christian apologetical work,
No.
that exists now, as well as sort of, more popular material that people can take advantage of, the that is,
Right, and you have guys engaging
yeah,
in academic journals,
yeah,
Sophia, not
right,
merely
yeah,
not merely
or someone,
Christian academic journals, but really cross the lines, philosophical academic
right.
journals and things like that. They've been
And
engaging.
that's even migrated into theology itself,
Yeah,
with this, analytic theology,
that's
which
right.
there's a book out by Michael Ray and Oliver Crisp from, I think, 2009 that people could pick up, where the tools of analytic philosophy of religion are being applied specifically to Christian doctrines, like
Right.
Trinity or the Incarnation or the Atonement and so on and so forth. So we do feel like, there's a lot of great work that's been done, and I don't know if we want to call this traditional apologetics, but it's starting to feel little. I think what we're doing, the reason we're doing this podcast is this kind of two-step of philosophical apologetics and historical apologetics, both of which are necessary components of the evangelistic endeavor, right? Either of defending what we believe or showing where other worldviews and their beliefs may be flawed.
Right.
But now there's a lot more talk about there being having been something like a shift in the culture again.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we need something that the term that often gets thrown around is cultural apologetics. Um, so I, I'm a little unclear on how people use this sometimes, right? I mean,
Yeah,
because it seems to me like what we just said is, in a sense, you're always just doing cultural apologetics.
yeah,
You're sort of just matching the culture with where it's at with whatever methods the culture is using to try and get at truth. Okay.
right, right.
I
Yeah,
don't know
I
if
don't
you
know.
agree with
I don't
that
know
or
that. I don't know that that term. It's been adopted quite a bit. Obviously, Paul Gould wrote a book on cultural
okay.
apologetics, titled it such, and I think people are still kind of fishing for what we actually call this new movement. And to be fair, we've to this point, analytic philosophical apologetics has always just been called apologetics. So even though that really there's if you look at there used to be the traditional breakdown of classical apologetics, evidential apologetics, right? There were different
Yeah, I never
emphases.
understood the point of wasting time on those I read
Right.
the book, the Five Views book, I
The
think.
five, yeah,
I read that, I'm like, like, with the exception maybe of presuppositionalism,
right.
clearly different.
Clearly different.
That's but the other 4 were all like,
Yeah.
but,
Well, it's more of where your starting point
yeah,
is what it all comes down to. So what's happening, and you bring up the point, is while we still live in a culture that where science is lauded and science is held in high regard, it's no longer the driving force
yeah,
that motivates people's lives. It used to be that and if you think back to the maybe popular commercials of the 1950s and 60s, the wonders of this new washing machine,
mhm,
scientific
right.
breakthroughs have
The home of
brought
the
us
future,
to.
the home of the
And
future, yeah,
if you ever wanted to sell any laundry detergent, you better have a guy in a white coat,
white
or
knuckling,
toothpaste.
yeah,
Four out
right,
of
right,
five, 4 out of 5 dentists recommend this gum. It's like, well, what's the holdout for? I want to talk to him. What's going on? But it's
yeah,
everything had this imprimatur of science, and we were in the space race, and I mean, and if you think about it, amazing things happened. You had polio vaccines being cured in the 50s. We had smallpox eradicated. First time a deadly disease that had always plagued humanity had been basically become extinct through human development. We landed a guy on the moon, and now with supercomputers, we've got the world in our palm of our hand. It's like an amazing shift happened within a short period of time, and everyone was really impressed by it. But the younger generation, the one that's coming up now, they take science for granted, in the
mm,
sense that they
mhm,
say, well, of course we're going to be able to control our environment. Of course we're going to be able to set our thermostats to whatever we want the temperature to be. Of course we're going to have 3 meals a day. We never have to worry about that. So there's this, because we live in such an affluent society that has so much control over the things that were primarily threats to us in the past, we get this kind of conceit that
mm,
we'll just assume that to be true. But what does that tell me about me? And of course, part of this shift comes in, as you wrote in a recent article about the psychological man, right?
yeah,
And the motivation there. But people are looking for meaning within themselves. So the problem is we've almost gotten too good at it. Everybody understands that you can fake, you can have CG
mhm,
and deep fakes and artificial intelligence, and you can create images to do whatever you want those images to do, whether they're true or not. So that unnerves a lot of people. They're like, well, I can't even trust the videos that I'm watching, right? You can't trust that. And everyone has seen even video clips on YouTube that aren't necessarily doctored, but they're truncated. So they don't tell the whole story. And however you frame the video,
oh, yeah, I just saw one today,
spins
yeah,
the narrative, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
we
right,
hear these terms in our society today. What's the narrative? So what happens is a lot of people today, especially those who have grown up with technology, are now saying, well, the only thing I really can trust is what I feel. It is my feelings that I know are true because I feel them directly and immediately.
Mm.
And that
Sounds
becomes
almost
their,
like Descartes.
yes,
This
it
is what I'm
becomes
directly in touch with, is my
right. And
inner
it
self.
becomes their kind of their epistemic
Guide.
basis.
Yeah.
And so what we're seeing today is a shift in values that we're not valuing the rational above all. We don't know if all of that's true or not.
Mhm.
People can argue me into a circle, but I know what I feel and I can't doubt what I feel. And therefore, this becomes a much more important aspect. And where do those feelings generate from? They generate from family to some extent, people, but much more so to when social circles, their friends become huge
Yeah.
now. You're seeing, matter of fact, you notice that even television shows have shifted from the 70s and 80s when it was family-based shows, right? It was All in the Family or the Brady Bunch or the
Cosby Show.
Cosby Show, Partridge, and there was the show Family with Wilford Brimley and all that.
Mhm.
You don't see those shows anymore. It's all about Friends
Yeah, well, then in
or
the
How I
90s,
Met
they
Your
changed it
Mother.
Seinfeld and Friends, the
Right,
actual show
right,
Friends,
right. And so it
and then
became,
Everybody Loves Raymond, which in a sense is still the funniest show
yeah.
ever made. But the family was super dysfunctional, right? That was
Yes, yeah.
the thing,
But
right?
for young people, they see themselves through their networks.
Yeah.
And because they're networks, one of the things that your friends do that your family doesn't is your friends are where you have the best times, but you don't have the discipline. So your friends make you feel better about yourself,
There's no authority
but they
structure amongst
don't
your friends.
they don't tell you the things you do wrong per se. They don't punish you for it.
Right.
And so again, we've become so um, ignorant of poor feelings that we try to shun them. We think that the good life means not ever feeling bad, and
Well, yeah,
that's part of the culture. So
yeah,
there's a lot of dysfunction in that. But what I'm saying is that's the underlying drive today. It's not how can I find the truth, whether I right even the famous aphorism, I have to follow the truth wherever it leads. It used to be the way that people would appreciate that. That's no longer true. It's
mhm,
how can I feel good about myself, whether that's morally by not being a Nazi or condemning Nazis or not hanging
right,
with Nazis or just in general,
yeah.
that somebody can help build up my self-esteem by telling
Well,
me
and
how
we
good I am.
see then you've said a lot. There's but we can see then from this sense of the good is having the maximum kind of frequency and intensity of positive emotional experiences,
Yeah,
right? That's good,
understanding oneself in a positive light,
right? And we
seeing
can see why
myself.
sexuality takes such a central
Right.
role in the culture because it's true that a lot of the way we see ourselves in positively or negatively is going to relate to how we use our bodies and our
When
sex.
you're in the moment,
Yeah,
right? Because when you're in the moment,
yeah,
it's like a drug or anything else. It
yeah.
shuts out all the other aspects. You're
Right.
not thinking about the walk of shame in the
Mhm.
moment. If you did, then nobody would be
Well,
having one.
let me okay, there's a lot to go because I now you got me thinking of some of the critical theorists, the Frankfurt School guys, and their especially Marcuse and his whole which by the way, let me mention since we kind of moved into this arena of talking about human beings as sort of psychological creatures. This is sort of the paradigm in society right now of how we're going to interpret ourselves through sort of a psychological lens that focuses on, our inner mental states. let me mention Carl Trueman's book, and we'll put a link in there in the video, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which is a very accessible, very mid-level read for most people, not too technical, but a great sort of genealogy of how we got here to this point.
Yeah, agreed.
And for maybe a little bit higher level um, exposition of that history, he draws off of three other thinkers, specifically Philip Rieff, the sociologist, Alistair McIntyre, the moral philosopher, and Charles Taylor, the also a philosopher, Canadian philosopher, who have written sort of bigger, more elaborate books on sort of the same thing of how we got to this place of being a culture sort of infused with seeing everything about ourselves and the way we interact in sort of a psychological kind of method or mode, right? We're not thinking
Right. Yeah.
theologically about ourselves primarily as image bearers of, a triune
We're
God.
not even thinking of ourselves as integrated with nature.
Right. I mean,
We're actually
yeah.
thinking of ourselves as independent and distinct from the world and somewhat from each other. This is why this whole gender ideology issue is so big, because we don't even think about ourselves as being those who are going to propagate the next generation. We're just thinking about ourselves as self-contained individuals to whom the world and even our social circles are ultimately tools for us to make ourselves feel better.
It does seem in reading some of the critical race theory literature, especially that, and I'm thinking of a particular piece by Angela Harris. One of the logical outworkings of this is a kind of a solipsism, right? It's kind of like, well, at some point, if there's nothing transcendent to the particular individual that we all share in, that we all participate in, and if you reduce humanity down to individuals and their individual set of mental and emotional states, right? I mean, it's almost like this image of the gray town in C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce, where everybody just gets further and further
That's
apart.
right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Hell is just this expansive city where nobody is near each other. They're
But
just
they're all
further and further
mad.
apart.
They're
They're all
all
mad.
they
Yeah.
want that happiness, but they're mad that they can't get it, and and it feeds on itself, and they start to eat themselves, and it actually makes them smaller and smaller. Yeah.
So let me draw some threads together. Early church apologetics responding to the culture, both philosophically and religiously, right? Because you had the gods of the pagans.
Well, religion was the ultimate truth. So
Yeah.
yeah, that you have to work within that arena.
Most everybody has a worldview that includes the supernatural, unless you're Lucretius or somebody, somebody in like Democritus's circles, early materialists. And then, of course, when you get to the synthesis, Aquinas's synthesis of sort of what's called the medieval synthesis, oftentimes of Greek philosophy with biblical revelation, and then you get the sort of a breaking apart of things in the early modern period, with maybe what Peter Craves called the turn away from looking out at the world and saying, "What is this?" to now turning into the self and saying, "What am I?" or "Who am I?" Kind of get that with Descartes. And we could say for an extended period, there was a belief, at least in the West, that this is what science was going to answer for us. Science was going to
Right.
sort of answer the "what are human beings" question, to
But
include
again, it's
the "how now shall we live" question.
yeah, and it's supposed that again, if you're assuming science is going to answer that, you're assuming a materialist framework
You're assuming a
from the get,
materialist framework.
because that's all science can answer. Science can't answer
Right.
the deeper spiritual questions. It has no way to. The scientific method, and remember, science is a methodology. It's
Yeah,
not it's not an ism, or it shouldn't be an ism. Sometimes it becomes an ism, but
scientism. Yeah,
yeah,
we're talking about.
but the scientific method has no way to work within the spiritual realm or within the
Moral realm.
non-material system.
Yeah, with the
Any
moral
non-material
realm,
system.
there's a good book by Hunter Nedleski called Science and the Good, where they go through the Enlightenment project of trying to ground moral values and duties in the scientific project, and they show how, look, it's a failed project. So, but now where we're at, I think we could say, this psychological culture, right? This, what we might call what I think Reef's term was that Trueman uses in the book, the therapeutic society, right? The
Right.
therapeutic,
Psychological man. Yeah.
right? So what's our apologetic? Was
Yeah.
the question. That,
Well,
so if we
see,
think we got a good idea of how the culture shifted, now
right.
we got to answer the question, what's our apologetic? What's
So
our,
this comes back to your initial question. What do we mean by when we use the term cultural apologetics?
yeah,
Because what we're trying, I think what is we're trying to pivot, and those who are on kind of the cutting edge of this and those who've been doing this for a number of years recognize that there's a pivot that's taking place. 5-10 years ago, for example, there was a myriad of talks on moral relativism. And because people were basically positing that, well, anyone's morality is their own morality and it can be good for them, things like that. And that's gone away because now our culture holds that there is a morality and you can't be a hater if you're right. There are
yeah,
certain things. Yeah, you can't be a
yeah,
bigot. You can't be there. These are non-negotiables. So the apologetic enterprise is trying to pivot and say, how do we do this? Now, one of the ways I think we do this is we actually go back to the medieval period when there wasn't this assumed materialism as its fundamental undergirding of epistemology. That wasn't what people had assumed. It wasn't, but the transcendentals, goodness, truth, and beauty, become more important again. And one of the things that cultural apologetics does is it tries to leverage those ideas. So I almost want, maybe we call it transcendental apologetics. Maybe that would be a
nice.
better
Got a
a,
very
a,
elevated sound to it.
a better term. But beauty is something valuable. And as our society becomes more racked, both morally racked, which everybody recognizes we've got societal problems, homelessness. I don't care which side of the aisle you're on, homelessness is an issue. There is racist, incidents that happen. Racism has not been purged from humanity. That just isn't going to happen. There is disparity economically. There's disparity, and sometimes that disparity is unfair. Sometimes that disparity does happen as a consequence of previous eras and some abuse that's happened in those eras. So there are these kinds of issues that have always been around and that are being around now that we have to address. And we need to lean into those to say beauty matters. But how do you understand beauty at all? Where does the idea of an objective beauty come from? The good matters. Being a good person isn't merely just how you feel within yourself. It's maybe how you make others feel. Maybe that's where the good comes in. Maybe part of the good is who is my neighbor, right? Go and do likewise. That kind of good, because nobody would balk at that kind of thing in the modern cultural movement. They picture themselves as the Samaritan beat up on the side of the road. Victim culture is
Yeah,
replete these days. So everybody's going to be some kind of a victim. And what Christianity says is, here's how we are supposed to treat the victims. Now,
yeah,
that's a much different argument than, hey, here's 5 reasons for God, the
yeah,
cosmological, teleological. Okay, but you're worried about victims. Well, only Christianity says the Samaritan is your neighbor. The hated enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. That's just doesn't happen in any other faith system, and it just doesn't happen in humanity before. So,
And
uh,
the key spiritual theological virtue, the one that our salvation relies on, is forgiveness.
yes,
All
exactly,
turns on reintroducing forgiveness into the culture. It's
right.
the culture that wants to claim victimhood
And at the same time, this
and also
culture,
exculpate itself from ever being the victimizer.
and you can use some of the same tools that the popular culture uses to reinforce their psychological um, uh, demands. So for example, one of the tools that plays an outsized influence on people today is popular media, specifically films, and to a lesser extent now music. Music used to be much more prevalent in society, but since the era of Spotify and headphones, everybody's individuated within their musical framework. Music still means a lot to people, but it's no longer a shared experience. Film is a shared experience. It's still something that you go to and and experience with a lot of people and talk to one another about. And that becomes actually a way a lot of people draw their info, because they feel what the filmmaker wants them to feel. They are living vicariously through the protagonist,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah, yeah.
so it becomes something. So if that's how they're communicating, we can then, we can use those points and say, that's a real, if you understand this film, then what you're actually looking for is something that only Christianity can offer. So, for example, the Truman Show, that was a great movie that talks about why you shouldn't believe false beliefs, even if they make you comfortable. I mean, ultimately,
Yeah, he
Truman's
breaks out at the end, right? He
right.
doesn't decide. He
But what
chooses
does he
not
break
to
out
stay.
into? He
Yeah,
he he had an idyllic life
right.
living inside the bubble.
Yeah,
His creator Christoph, and there's a whole lot of God illusion in this
right.
film, who's up high in the sun, right? His
Mhm.
name's Christoph. I mean, that's, and he's talking to him. So, I created you. I made you.
You.
You don't know what it's like out there. There's bums on the street out there. You could lose your life. You could get hit by a car. Inside here, you're completely safe. You can live an idyllic life. You can have everything you want. And Truman says, I would rather step out into the real world, even though it's going to cost me something, than live in. And isn't that what we tell people with Christianity? It's like Christianity may not give you a safe life, but it's the
Yes,
real life.
it's the real life, but where there's one crucial difference in the Truman Show, which is sort of your updated Plato's Cave,
Right.
is that when Truman breaks out into the real world and there's dangers and everything there, yes, but when Plato breaks out, what looks beyond the
Right.
puppets and the fire in the cave, and breaks out into the realm of the forms, right? Then there's not then ultimately there is the good, right? There and so while we would say breaking out into the real world is going to be difficult because you're still in this particular
Right.
period or mode of that world, ultimately there is the greater hope
Yes.
of being in the new creation, um right, where the car's not going to run over you and
Yeah.
nobody is homeless, everybody's at home.
That's right. That's
um
right. But you see, the point is that you can, when you sit down and watch that film with someone, no one's going to say, no, Truman, don't do it.
yeah, right,
Nobody in the audience is cheering for him not. Nobody in the audience is saying, Neo, don't take the pill.
right.
Okay. Or
And
when Cypher says, I want to be put back in. Remember that scene?
yeah,
I don't want to remember anything. I want to be put, he's the villain,
yeah, right,
because
right.
I mean, they're living, what are they eating? This like oatmeal slop in threadbare clothes, as opposed to living in New York in the 1990s, being a hacker and sophisticated and all that. That it's another picture, but the audience understands that reality has a value within itself that's greater than one's individual comfort. And so what you can do is you can use those aspects of film to say, maybe your feelings aren't the primary, maybe feelings of discomfort aren't the ultimate value that you should be seeking. So you can say, because you wouldn't seek it in this film, you don't want to be Truman and be left in the television show, right? You don't want to be Neo and be left in the Matrix simulation, do you?
Right.
You want to be free.
Yeah.
Isn't freedom more valuable than comfort?
Yeah.
And so you can help people today through a tactile way of understanding what you're trying to say, as opposed to a purely logical reasoning argument.
Right. That's good. That's good. And that really does, I mean, the aesthetics is part of that approach,
Yes.
right? Because we use stories, we use powerful narratives, beautiful imagery, beautiful plot lines, to
And
compel
just the idea
something
of beauty itself, beauty has a
that's not
value.
irrational, but it's sort of irrational. It's sub-rational.
Yeah.
It's more well, I mean, I was reading this German
It's
sociologist talks about how, this shaping of the human instincts.
yeah,
Well,
it's spiritual.
everybody,
Yeah.
it's spiritual, right? We're shaping the instincts we're trying to help people understand those instincts, not just in a psychological framework, but in a spiritual framework.
Right.
Right, exactly. And then that gets us right to Jesus too, then.
Right. And then you have the moral aspect too. And I've done a bunch of work on this. It's the superhero genre is
Yeah.
very popular simply because it promises an idea of justice, of true justice served, that there's bad. We all know that there's bad things that happen out in the world. We recognize that. And there's something inside of us that instinctively says that evil that's in the world needs to be adjudicated. It needs to, we need to be able to punish those who are evil. We need to help the victim and help the poor. And again, that is a uniquely Christian idea. The Romans would have thought, well, if you're losing at war, then you were just weaker, and
Yeah.
that's the gods have deemed it, right?
Yeah, it does say
Aristotle in his Politics
Yep.
starts off with this. He says, hey, people are slaves because they need to be slaves.
right.
I mean, it's like page one.
Right. No, that's right. I mean, so we would say then if the culture has shifted from a more analytic, logical, centered, and also materialistic
Hmm.
culture to a culture that's more internal, more interior,
Right.
Not illogical or irrational, but where that
Rational.
are rational. It's more primal. It's more in the level of instincts, desires, feelings. Then one and Truman does mention this in the epilogue of the book, which he calls a prologue, but he puts it at the end. That aesthetics, a Christian art, so it doesn't sound too fancy, is going to be one means of one apologetical
Right.
method, right, to use to try and attract people to Christ, right? And we do need a better. It's getting there. It's getting there. Um, I don't think we've recaptured the great era of like movies like Ben-Hur.
No.
I'm talking about the 1959 version, but we're getting there. The movies, maybe the TV
They're
show,
becoming more sophisticated, and we're having
more
Christians who
nuanced.
aren't making specifically Christian films, but are starting to implicate Christianity within their framework. Yeah.
That's good because one of the things that one of the things that I sort of tried to sum up the current culture with, and this is in part because of the damage the 19th century did, was in the 19th century, you lose any semblance of formal or final causation,
Mm.
right? There's no essences to anything, right? And there's no teleology, there's no goal or aim for anything.
Yeah.
You get postmodernism with that. Basically, that's what you get: postmodernism, art, literature, everything's just kind of, there's just a bunch of stuff. Things happen, there's events, there's happenings, but nothing's really directed anywhere. Nothing's really going anywhere. And then human beings, we sort of get lost. We don't know what we are. We don't know. We don't believe that we're an essential thing, and we have no direction. Right?
Mm.
Nothing that's guiding us. So one way to sort of reintroduce that sense of um, design and purpose, right, is through art. Maybe that's where we got to
Yeah.
start before we get into the
Well,
more.
and really, humanity is the only living beings that are here that can appreciate that. I mean,
Yeah,
we don't. So people don't, or they shouldn't. I mean, sometimes when folks aren't thinking, they'll deny the objective nature of beauty. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And my response is, really, let me ask you, if you're sitting at dawn on the edge of the Grand Canyon,
yeah,
at sunrise, and the colors are rich, and are you going to say, well, that's ugly? You know, nobody
yeah,
says that. They
right,
may say, I'm in no mood to appreciate it right now, but
right,
nobody says that's objectively disgusting. Yeah.
right.
So,
And there's a reason why Italy and Bavaria and France, southern France, can live off of tourism.
right, right, yeah,
Right? There's a reason for that.
well, or something as simple as a newborn baby being coddled by its mother.
Yeah.
Just, now the baby may not be cute. Okay. That happens. I had somebody come up to me once, you'd say, so, newborn child, who do you think he looks like, the mother or his father? Looks like Churchill. What are you talking about? But the baby may not necessarily be attractive right after birth.
Yeah,
The mother may not necessarily be attractive, but there is something always attractive
right,
about a mother cradling her first child. I
right,
mean, you just see that love, and that's always attractive. So you have to start asking, there's meaning in that. What grounds that meaning? Where do we as people get that? And it's because we're image bearers. It's because we understand that goodness, truth, and beauty all find their grounding in God, in his nature and who he is. It's not simply morality that is grounded in God's nature. It's beauty and truth, because they all come together.
right.
Something that's deeply moral and deeply true is beautiful. Something that's beautiful and moral is going to be true.
Yeah.
They all find their emergence
Yeah.
in
I
the
mean, the
Godhead.
romantic poets in Germany basically collapsed. I mean, they said the same thing that, I mean, or what was Keats's famous line, beauty is truth, truth, beauty, that is all you
Right.
know on earth and all you need know. So they understood that, and then they wanted to ground, of course, they wanted to ground moral values and obligations in just natural beauty,
Right.
which
You can't
obviously
do it.
that's not going to work. Um, so I want to wrap this up. I think we did a good job of covering sort of, I think we got a good understanding what cultural apologetics is. It's just responding to the culture as it presents itself.
Right.
The culture that the church is inhabiting at a given time in history and a given location of the world. Uh, you got to study that culture. And we recommend Trueman's book again, or if you want to go heavier, Charles Taylor's book, A Secular Age, will certainly do it for you. And then responding in
Yeah.
kind, and filling in the blanks where the culture's
It's being
deficient.
in the world, but
Yeah,
not part of it. You have to be in
right,
the world. You have to understand that, not, and that doesn't mean that we just have to live our lives day to day. It's really being able to take a step back and understanding the differences between the Christian worldview and the worldview as assumed today. And if you can notice those differences, then you can speak into the world appropriately to show why those assumptions actually lead to certain problems. So, for example, I think we both agree that the psychological man is very much who we are today, and that feelings, especially self-worth and things like that, have an outsized bearing on people's. Yet at the same time, we're living now today in a state where depression is at an all-time high.
yeah,
So
You don't
what
look at yourself too long, you're gonna get depressed.
what's
Even
going
yeah,
on there? Yeah,
yeah,
and it was interesting even in Nietzsche's day, right? He's pushing for the Superman, but actually his philosophy leads to nihilism.
when he goes crazy personally,
And
like, he
he
literally
goes
goes
crazy
crazy.
himself.
Yeah.
But isn't it interesting that when you chase these false philosophies, they not only break down, they seem to um, you seem to fall into the very contradictory state of what you were hoping to achieve, which is
Yes.
really a lot of what the devil does. It's that,
Yeah.
as the father of lies, he could set up these subtle little lies to do these kinds of things. And that's why Jesus says, look, it's the last who shall be first, right? It's the greatest is the servant of all. The biblical admonition for love flips everything on its head because God knows how he built us, and he knows where our weaknesses are, where our foibles are, and he knows what makes us better individuals.
Yeah.
And that makes all the difference. If you get your eyes off of your own feelings and start serving others, truly for the sake of serving others or for the sake of serving God, but by serving others, all of a sudden, all those other things start to fade away. And
Yeah.
it's an amazing thing. And this is
Right.
so this is what being in the world, but being not part of the world means.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I kinda wanna end there. Kinda wanna end on that sentiment. At the end of the day, we're gonna the true liberation comes when we find our identity not in our own self,
Right.
but in the creator who made us and in the son who comes to redeem us. It has come to redeem us. I will say, I think I want to do another a part two of this though
Oh yeah, that'd be great.
as well. Because and I'll have another article on this coming out on Monday on this or Tuesday. Because I don't think we're going to be staying in the therapeutic society that much longer.
Mm.
I have a sense that
There are cracks in the
um,
wall, definitely.
things are moving. Things just move faster these days,
Oh,
part because of the technology that we have developed. And I don't know how long we're going to be living in this paradigm of psychological man. I think we are already seeing sort of leaks in the dam.
yeah.
And I want to do some speculative work maybe the next time when we come back on
Okay.
what might be coming after. What
I'm 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 I'm
you know?
interested in seeing
Yeah.
because one of the things that I'm interested in seeing is how transhumanism starts to play out
And
in
that's one
this.
of the things that maybe we'll talk about next time because I
Okay.
think we got to as a church we have to work in the culture we're in and do what we can, but we also have to have a little bit of foresight as
Yeah.
well because
That's
the church and its theology does always seem to be lagging behind on where the culture winds up. So we'll do a little speculation in part two of this podcast. When we,
sounds great, Darren.
all right, Lenny, thanks a lot.